By the late 20th century, Providence, Rhode Island, was no longer a destination. It was a structural prison. Imagine a historic downtown buried alive under suffocating asphalt. A ghost town at rush hour, violently severed from its own waterfront by a twisting throat of elevated highway. The city had earned a grim reputation as a rusted industrial relic, a municipal anomaly where the economic veins had long since ceased to pump. We have been fed a comforting textbook narrative to explain this decay, that the city simply outlived its manufacturing prime, fading naturally as textile mills drifted south. It is a clean story, it is a relatable story, and it is a complete fabrication. The truer reality is far more chilling. The slow death of Providence was not an historical accident but a brutal mathematical certainty. In a desperate rush to modernize, city planners executed a series of catastrophic shortcuts that turned beautiful geography into a structural suicide pact. Welcome to Chronicles of Time. Today, we unroll the dark blueprints of this modern disaster to expose how an elite metropolis choked on its own progress, and how an impossible engineering rescue finally saved its dying industrial soul. To understand how Providence transformed from a pristine sanctuary of freedom into an industrial choke point, we have to peel back the modern veneer and look at its original ideological blueprint. Founded in 1636 by the radical renegade preacher Roger Williams, the colony of Rhode Island was designed as a lively experiment in total soul liberty, a pure haven where the conscience of man was completely separate from the heavy hand of the state. It was a beautiful, revolutionary concept. But as the decades rolled on, that pure spiritual blueprint collided head-on with a cold, unforgiving maritime economy. The pristine soil of New England couldn't yield massive fortunes, so the city's emerging elite looked to the ocean, replacing the pursuit of salvation with the ruthless engine of global capital. Enter the Brown family, a merchant oligarchy that would structurally carve their name into the very landscape of the city. For decades, a fierce ideological civil war raged within this single family, mirroring the divided soul of the city itself. On one side stood Moses Brown, a devout Quaker convert who became a passionate abolitionist, dedicating his life to social reform and philanthropy. On the opposite side stood his older brother John Brown, a brilliant but unapologetic tycoon who saw human beings as mere cargo. John plugged Providence directly into the dark veins of the transatlantic triangular trade, churning out vast wealth from a deadly cycle of rum, molasses, and enslaved Africans. In 1764, John financed the disastrous voyage of the slave ship Sally, an expedition of unmitigated horror that left a permanent stain on the family legacy. The suffocating stench of molasses on the docks masked the clinking iron chains echoing from down below the wooden decks, where human lives were bartered for gold. John Brown wasn't just chasing money. He was constructing a sprawling trade network that weaponized global suffering to enrich his hometown. He wanted total corporate autonomy, and he was willing to burn down the established order to protect his maritime empire. But mainstream history books have systematically hidden a truly terrifying truth about his next move. Mainstream American lore treats the burning of His Majesty's schooner Gaspee on June 9, 1772, as a glorious, entirely selfless act of pre-revolutionary patriotism. We are taught it was the first real blow struck against royal tyranny, a sacred defense of liberty. But if you look at the blueprints of colonial commerce, a far more transactional picture emerges. This was not a spontaneous outburst of pure ideological fervor. It was a cold, calculated defense of illicit merchant profits. King George III had stationed Lieutenant William Dudingston in Narragansett Bay to enforce strict revenue laws and aggressively crack down on rampant maritime smuggling. Duddingston was ruthlessly halting local ships, seizing cargo, and paralyzing local transit. For tycoons like John Brown, this was not just an unwanted political overreach, it was a direct, lethal threat to their economic survival. The British Crown was systematically boggling up the lucrative, unregulated trade routes that built the city's fortune on the backs of human suffering and cheap molasses. At 1 a.m., under a pitch-black New England sky, a fleet of longboats quietly slipped onto the glassy waters of the bay. Their wooden oars were wrapped in thick cloth to mute the sound of their rowing against the current. Led by John Brown and Captain Abraham Whipple, this highly organized group of merchants swarmed the stranded British vessel. A single musket shot suddenly ripped through the midnight silence, the lead ball tearing directly into Lieutenant Duddingston. The raiders evacuated the crew before unleashing a torrent of fire that engulfed the entire ship, illuminating the dark waters with a roaring wall of corporate defiance. Mainstream history calls it an awakening. The blueprint calls it an act of asset protection. With the Crown's maritime blockade broken, Providence was finally free to conquer a new horizon, the inland industrial age. To fuel this massive manufacturing boom, urban engineers would soon execute a geographical shortcut, so devastatingly short-sighted it would literally choke and bury the natural, vibrant aquatic heart of the city under millions of tons of suffocating artificial earth, paving over their own primary source of ecological human survival. In the twilight of the 18th century, Moses Brown fundamentally altered the physical and economic destiny of Rhode Island. Recognizing that maritime trade was becoming dangerously volatile, he looked inland toward the kinetic energy of running water. In 1790, he partnered with an English immigrant named Samuel Slater. Slater had committed an act of high-stakes industrial espionage, memorizing the highly classified blueprints of Britain's advanced textile machinery before slipping past customs. In a small mill along the Pawtucket River, Slater reconstructed those stolen mechanical designs from pure memory, establishing the first successful water-powered cotton spinning mill in America. The quiet valleys suddenly erupted with the deafening, rhythmic clatter of mechanical looms. This was the true cradle of the American Industrial Revolution, an explosion of manufacturing capability that minted staggering fortunes overnight. But this unprecedented economic miracle required a violent reshaping of the earth. As factories proliferated, the city desperately needed a centralized logistics hub to export its massive wave of textiles. In 1845, the Iron Horse arrived, and railroads quickly demanded total dominance over the urban landscape. To build the expansive rail yards and passenger depots needed to feed these coal-fired engines, industrial planners targeted the Great Salt Cove, a vast brackish estuary that formed the natural breathing core of early Providence. Engineers launched a relentless campaign of environmental erasure, systematically dumping millions of tons of gravel, industrial waste, and rock into the vibrant tidal basin. They called it progress. In reality, it was the construction of the Great Salt Shroud, a catastrophic shortcut that permanently choked the city's primary natural drainage network and buried it beneath a suffocating blanket of artificial land. The living waters were brutally enslaved, transformed from life-giving estuaries into stagnant, foul canals tasked with carrying away toxic grease and industrial refuse. The logic of the machine had completely conquered the laws of nature. Yet, as the rivers choked, a glittering new empire crystallized on the paved ground, driven by a technological breakthrough that would turn this small capital into a global phenomenon. But this dazzling golden age carried a biological debt. As the textile empires expanded along the rivers, an entirely different industrial beast materialized on the newly filled ground, driven by a raw material that was both incredibly lucrative and brilliantly deceptive: silver and gold. By the mid-19th century, Providence was no longer just a manufacturing town. It had officially crowned itself the undisputed capital of American jewelry and the global epicenter of fine silverware. This meteoric rise was spearheaded by the Gorham Manufacturing Company, a corporate juggernaut that started with humble spoon molding but quickly evolved into an engineering pioneer. Under the aggressive direction of John Gorham, the factory introduced massive, steam-powered drop presses mounted with precision-cut steel dies. The physical effect on the neighborhood was intense. The earth itself literally trembled daily under the deafening, bone-rattling thunder of heavy machinery stamping out flawless, intricate metal patterns at an unprecedented, industrialized scale. In 1873, right as an economic depression threatened the nation, Gorham received a legendary commission to forge the historic Ferber silver service, a breathtaking Victorian masterpiece containing 740 individual pieces of sterling silver that required 17 massive crates to transport. Providence had transformed into the world's greatest engine of opulence. Wealth was no longer measured in raw currency, but in the blinding reflection of polished metal and the fortunes of elite tycoons. Yet, this gleaming golden era carried a devastatingly toxic biological debt that no amount of silver could ever hope to repay. Inside the suffocating walls of the massive foundries, workers labored in exhausting heat, breathing in volatile fumes as rivers of copper and bronze were melted into liquid form. The immediate environment paid a permanent price for this unparalleled wealth. While the city's elite celebrated their global prestige, the very waterways that birthed the city were being systematically poisoned. Because the rapid industrial expansion completely lacked any defensive planning for hazardous waste disposal, the rivers effectively became open, toxic sewers. As hundreds of thousands of desperate souls arrived, a horrific biological crisis was about to unleash absolute urban devastation. But what force would trigger this pending municipal nightmare? The glittering wealth produced by silver and textiles acted as a powerful demographic magnet, drawing waves of desperate people across the Atlantic Ocean. By the late 19th and early 20th centuries, steamships belonging to the legendary Faber Line docked regularly at the city's ports, unloading thousands of Italian, Portuguese, and Irish immigrants eager to escape European poverty. By 1900, an astonishing 60% of the city's ballooning population was of foreign descent. This sudden massive human influx turned neighborhoods like Federal Hill and the North End into a vibrant, chaotic demographic mosaic. Rotting tenement houses were packed to the absolute brink, filling the narrow alleys with a rich, overlapping cacophony of regional dialects, old country traditions, and the distinct aroma of foreign foods. But beneath this vibrant cultural tapestry lay a wretched, hyper-stratified social reality that was rapidly approaching a breaking point. The city's elite completely ignored the basic human infrastructure required to support this massive labor force. Families were forced to survive in cramped, disease-ridden slums where raw human sewage and volatile chemical runoff from the jewelry foundries combined to turn the local rivers into open, toxic sewers. This complete failure of municipal planning triggered a catastrophic biological crisis. In 1854, the city suffered a devastating cholera epidemic that tore through the immigrant neighborhoods, leaving hundreds dead. Decades later, corporate greed ignited the historic macaroni riots of 1914, when predatory suppliers artificially squeezed food prices, driving starving laborers to violently clash with armed police in the streets of Federal Hill. When the manufacturing sector suddenly collapsed following the deindustrialization crisis of the 1920s, Providence was left as a rusting, impoverished ghost of its former self. Its tax base evacuated to the emerging suburbs, leaving behind a hollowed-out municipal skeleton. To save the city from total economic obliteration, 20th century planners brought in a radical new weapon: heavy engineering. But mercantile town planners had absolutely no concept that their massive, newly rolled asphalt solution was about to drop a brutal, concrete guillotine directly across the city's living throat, completely suffocating the fragile economic organism of local community. The desperate fix arrived in the mid-1950s under the banner of urban renewal, but it would manifest as the most destructive, short-sighted engineering shortcut in the city's history. Desperate to stop the massive flight of businesses and residents to the booming suburbs, municipal planners turned to a radical new savior: heavy machinery and endless sheets of black asphalt. They authorized the construction of the North-South Freeway, which later became Interstate 95, alongside Interstate 195. The plan was deceptively simple: cut a massive highway corridor directly through the dense urban core to funnel suburban shoppers straight into the central business district. But the physical realization of this mapmaker's dream was an absolute butchery. The highway became a brutal concrete guillotine, violently slicing the living organic tissue of long-standing neighborhoods into completely isolated pieces. The construction crews aggressively flattened vibrant historic city blocks, bulldozing thousands of family homes and wiping out beloved green community spaces like Hayward Park. To make matters worse, engineers erected a towering wall of elevated railroad tracks and freeway overpasses that effectively acted as a modern Great Wall of China. This massive barrier completely severed the historic, majestic, marble-domed State House on Smith Hill from the commercial center below, visually and physically isolating the seat of government from the citizens it was meant to represent. When the gray concrete dried, the planning shortcut had backfired spectacularly. Instead of bringing life into the dying center, the high-speed corridors simply made it effortless for drivers to bypass the city altogether. Providence's core didn't revitalize. It suffered a slow, painfully suffocating death. The streets became a desolate concrete wasteland, and by 1982 the last grand department store permanently boarded up its windows. The core was completely hollow, widely derided as the armpit of New England, an urban desert of empty pavements and surface parking lots. But in a city where legitimate commerce had completely vanished, a massive power vacuum opened in the shadows, and nobody expected that the fate of the entire region would soon be controlled by an invisible empire operating out of a tiny cigarette storefront right on Federal Hill. When legitimate commerce vanished from the hollowed-out center, the vacancy was filled by an entirely different kind of architect, one who ruled not from City Hall, but from a quiet storefront on Federal Hill. Raymond Patriarca built a ruthless syndicate, governing the vast criminal underworld of New England from the Coin-O-Matic, an unassuming cash-only tobacco vending shop. To the casual passer-by, it was a harmless neighborhood fixture. In truest reality, it operated as a multi-million-dollar laundering front and the central nervous system of an invisible Mafia empire. Behind those dusty glass windows, wrapped within thick clouds of stale tobacco smoke, cold-blooded syndicate orders were calmly passed down. Extortion, loan sharking, gambling, prostitution, and high-profile executions were orchestrated beside the rhythmic clink of tumbling quarters. Patriarca's grip on power was total, extending his reach as far as Miami and Las Vegas, corrupting state politicians, judges, and entire police forces. Secret wiretaps eventually exposed a staggering architecture of systemic corruption that kept the state functionally paralyzed. But even an ironclad criminal empire eventually fractures. The real catalyst for a dramatic structural reset did not emerge from a federal indictment, but from the explosive rise of a young, fiercely ambitious special prosecutor named Vincent Buddy Cianci. Cianci famously vaulted into the media spotlight by ruthlessly securing a conviction in a notorious mob murder trial that targeted Patriarca's inner ring. This monumental courtroom triumph instantly catapulted the charismatic populist straight into City Hall, elected under a crusading anti-corruption reform banner. Cianci boldly promised to burn the old municipal scripts and drag his hometown out of its rusted grave. He harbored a desperate desire to completely dismantle the planning sins of the past. But his path to rebirth would plunge the capital into a high-stakes war between two conflicting architectural blueprints, where a world-renowned planner would try to construct a magnificent plaza, only to leave behind an eerie concrete tomb that further isolated the fractured local population, masking a darker urban decay that would completely redefine how humanity interacts with its historical modern monuments. To fix the decay, the municipal state apparatus threw millions of dollars at world-renowned masterminds. In the 1960s, the Providence Redevelopment Agency commissioned legendary modernist architect I.M. Pei to redesign a 54-acre urban swath called Weybosset Hill. Pei's grand centerpiece was Cathedral Square, a masterclass in brutalist style explicitly meant to emulate the lively, bustling public plazas of Europe. Planners confidently envisioned a vibrant meeting place full of civic interaction, completely surrounded by modern residential units. But when the dust settled, this top-down blueprint failed catastrophically due to an absolute ignorance of local human scale. Cathedral Square did not become an open-air oasis. It became a chillingly desolate gray concrete tomb. The vast expanses of raw pavement sat completely empty under the harsh New England sky, an uninviting architectural vacuum where local pedestrians actively refused to walk, further choking the dying downcity commerce. Traditional urban renewal had constructed a tragic monument to its own extreme arrogance. Yet, while the master architects built these tombs of concrete, an underground structural mutiny was quietly brewing inside the design studios of the Rhode Island School of Design. In 1974, a radical collective of visionary student architects threw out the establishment models and unrolled a revolutionary alternative master plan known as Interface Providence. Painted in bold, hand-drawn strokes, their wild proposal seemed completely absurd to old-school town planners. These students suggested an unthinkable, near impossible idea. Stop building around the automobile, dismantle the elevated railroad lines cutting through the center, hand the streets back to pedestrians, and most shockingly, unearth and resurrect the ancient rivers hidden beneath the black asphalt. Conservative politicians and highway engineers immediately dismissed these students as naive, artistic dreamers who completely misunderstood the brutal economics of a modern industrial city. Yet this underground student manifesto secretly caught the undivided attention of a brilliant local architect named William Warner. Warner looked past the raw sketches and recognized a breathtaking engineering truth. A colossal conflict between two urban destinies had officially crystallized. A daring team of progressive engineers was about to perform open-heart surgery on this living American city. In the 1980s, the impossible vision held by those architecture students finally met the brutal, pragmatic grit of municipal politics. Under the ambitious leadership of city planners and architects like William Warner, Providence initiated the River Relocation Project, a breathtaking engineering endeavor that defied conventional urban wisdom. They didn't just clean up the city. They literally performed open-heart surgery on its geography. Crews systematically dismantled the massive concrete slabs and elevated highways that had choked the downtown core for decades. In a logistical feat that resembled an ancient earth-moving project, they re-excavated the buried riverbeds, forcing the Moshassuck and Woonasquatucket rivers to abandon their dark, subterranean prison and rejoin into a single, light-filled artery flowing through the heart of the capital. This wasn't just infrastructure, it was the total erasure of a planning failure. The physical result was Waterplace Park, a stunning network of winding Venetian-style pedestrian bridges and stone-lined walkways. But the true genius was not just in the water. It was in the revival of human connectivity. To draw the disillusioned public back into a downtown that had been abandoned for half a century, the city launched Waterfire, a mesmerizing, multi-sensory art performance. Night after night, nearly 100 iron braziers were ignited, sending flickering amber flames dancing across the newly exposed river surface, set to a haunting, ethereal soundtrack. This was the final, defiant answer to the mid-century urban planners who thought they could bury a city's history under concrete. Providence hadn't just repaired its urban skeleton, it had reconnected with its own soul. The fire that had once burned through industry was now channeled into a symbol of artistic rebirth. Every flicker on that water served as a silent, glowing witness to the lesson of 1636. A city is not made of asphalt or highways, but of the connections we weave between our history and our horizon. The blueprints of the past didn't just die, they were finally rewritten, transforming a charcoal pit of industrial despair into a triumph of human ambition. Let's continue to deconstruct the engineering of the world around us.